Hey, today we are going to be talking about how to make your essay flow. It's one of the most really nebulous topics to come up, and I like to wait till later in the semester once we've built up some ideas about structure and the basics of quoting and MLA, P's paragraphs, those kinds of things. Because when a student asks me, how do I make my paper flow? That's There's not one answer. It's a very complex answer, and we're going to talk about some strategies that might help you. Um, for one thing, if you ever find a great resource for this, let me know because I've never seen a good lecture on it. So hang with me. So usually when students ask this question, it's when they don't know where to put their points in the essay. Got all this great information, they know where their thesis goes, they know where the conclusion goes, and then the rest, they're like, where do I start? My transitions feel really strange and forced. So, we're going to be looking at some strategies of framing, how to use metaphor to help hold your paper together and give it some structure. We're also just going to talk about some of the basics about where you can put background information, where to put counter arguments, where should you use personal examples in an essay that's mostly about research. And mostly I'm going to talk about ways you can organize your paragraphs using the logical structure of cause and effect and solution, which is one way to think about a lot of academic essays. So it's one of the reasons that I'm kind of pushing this idea of a problem solution paper for this particular assignment. Okay, framing is a lot like how a picture frame works. So it's a way of starting your paper with a thought and finishing up your paper with a reference to that initial thought. One super traditional way to do that is to use a source quote as your attention getter in your introduction paragraph, and then to come back to a further analysis of that quote in your conclusion. It gives this lovely wrap up feeling when you come back to where you started. So, what I'm going to be using in this lecture today is this graphic essentially, where you can see I've laid out these pages, pages 1 and 2 on the left, pages 3 and 4 on the right, since our assignments are typically 4 pages long. And uh, even though I know body paragraphs aren't necessarily always half a page long, I've blocked them in that way just so we can talk about them in different ways. I do find this helpful myself in thinking about putting together content for an essay because my paragraphs are typically about half a page or longer in length. Then I know how many distinct paragraph ideas I need to have before I start because I can count it out like this if I know what my page limit is. So another way to frame, and this is one that I love, is when you frame with a story or with metaphor. So we are storytellers. People love a good story. A fancy way of saying storyline is narrative arc, if you've ever taken a fiction class. So, and this is when you have a distinct beginning, middle, and end to your paper. Um, and again, this gives your readers the closure that we talked about with the quote. So, in this case, you start your paper with a catchy, creative scene that relates to your topic, or a metaphor that you come up with describes the dynamic going on in your topic. And then you finish that scene or expand on the metaphor in your conclusion. So this is called framing. All right, so I don't actually have I don't actually have a term for this, but I'm calling it weaving. And weaving is when you take the framing idea a little bit further and you weave that story or the metaphor um, throughout your paper. So that's shown with the little red stars. So this is if I started with a lovely metaphor in my introduction, I could keep going and developing that metaphor, talking about different aspects of it, in a body paragraph here on page 2, one here in body paragraph 5, maybe here in body paragraph 6, come back to it in the conclusion. So this kind of extended metaphor is called an analogy, and it makes you look so super slick. It makes you look so smart. And it adds this feeling of tremendous thoughtfulness to your paper to see these ideas come up uh, repeatedly in your paper. You just want to make sure that they don't take over your topic sentences, right? So, analogy, personal examples, right? These should be used to support your idea, right? As that you can use them as part of your evidence, but don't let them take over your whole paragraph. I want to talk about some places to put some extra information that you might be trying to shove into your paper somewhere. The first body paragraph, and it is a body paragraph, I want to be really, really clear, but it's a place where you can provide more historical context or background information. Um, it'll still need a topic sentence. It still needs to follow that piece structure, but you can think of it as almost an optional overflow to your introduction material. I find sometimes that this kind of general information will wander in almost like as an explanation at the end of the paper, and it's really more appropriate to put that historical background information early on in your paper to let your reader know that you understand, the terms of the debate. Counter arguments. We're going to be talking about counter arguments soon. They're very difficult to do. If you haven't already experienced that, it's my experience. Hard to do well. So one thing you want to be sure to do is to think about placement of your counter argument later in your paper. So you want to make sure that your claim is really, really clear and you've given lots of awesome evidence for it before you slip in the counter argument towards the end. And then you also want to give yourself time to close with a strong point on your side. So you're not left hanging with this idea that you've changed, you've changed your mind if you're at the end of your essay. My daughter wandered through while I was putting together this lecture and she said, yeah, explain it to your students. It's like when you want to convince your parents to let you go out. You give three good reasons why they should let you go out. Then you slip in a point about how, you understand they might have a particular concern, and then you quick close with another important reason why they should let you go out. So this whole lecture has made me feel really bad about my relationship with my child, but hopefully that's a great little story that will help you out. So if you want to organize your paper with a cause, effect, and solution format, this can really just make the flow happen for you, honestly, because readers recognize this as a traditional way of structuring discussions. It will create logical progression between your paragraphs, which in turn creates natural transitions between the ideas. So you're not going to have to force those transitions. And okay, so I want to go through those before I talk about point three. So if we look at this, I have focused the three different elements together. So in this example, you can see I've started out with two body paragraphs on cause, then I moved to two on effect, then to two on solution before I get to my conclusion. I do want to emphasize that before using a personal example in any one of these areas, make sure that you've strengthened your stance by using a point from one of the sources. Uh, it, and that's particularly important if you are going to build an entire piece paragraph around your own experience. In a college paper, it's typically best to precede that personal example paragraph with a paragraph that uses source to give a little bit more strength to the upcoming point. You can also use this kind of organization to organize your subpoints. So you can see in this one, and this happens all the time, right? Rarely are you going to have an essay which has equal thirds of the three different parts of cause, effect, and solution. So, for instance, you may have 4 body paragraphs worth of cause. One point you want to make about effect, one point before you move on to solution. One common question I get is, well, how do I decide what order to put those 4 red cause body paragraphs in? So, 2 common ways to create a logical flow between those sections is to think about prioritization. Typically, in argumentation, you move from the most important idea to the least important because you want to lead with that heavy hitting idea. So, you would prioritize um, the body paragraph on page 1, your most important concept, then move down through until you get to the least important concept, as shown here in the block in the top of page 3. Another way you can do it is you can go chronological, where you move through the ideas historically, which is nice because then you can look at the future when you get to your conclusion. Um, Chronological can sometimes feel like you haven't put a lot of thought into the ordering of them and you just came up with chronological because you couldn't think of a different way to organize them. But if it's done well and you're really talking about how the ideas are impacting each other as you move through time, and cause and effect, that can be very, very cool. Just be careful it doesn't seem too pat, and you really don't want to start your paragraphs with first, then the next paragraph starts second, next paragraph starts third. So those aren't actual transitions, those are just numbers that you aren't helping you out. All right, so I've given you all this information as if it's some kind of rule. It's not a rule. I don't think you'll find it anywhere, but it is a typical organization structure which your reader will understand and recognize. It gives them one less thing to think about. So I put this one up here because I wanted to emphasize there's no particular rule about grouping the paragraphs together for sure. Like in this one, you can see I've moved through the series of cause, effect, and solution 3 different times, or sorry, 2 different times. So you can repeat, you can interrupt the pattern, whatever helps you cover the material more clearly. It's also completely possible to start out with the solution, and then talk about the effect that you're trying to, ameliorate with that solution, and then it goes back to the cause. For sure, you can do that. It's just typically easier to move through the 3 different items in this particular order. So feel free to move them around, multiply them where you want, but hopefully this will give you a basis to start from in organizing your paper. One thing I like to do is logic mapping. I do this in a couple different ways. Sometimes I'll just give students a giant piece of paper and they can write out on the paper different blocks that have their main points. And then we spend some time thinking about, how can we move from one idea to another? Like, what are these arrows are representing, like connecting ideas? Oh, this idea leads to this idea. This idea leads to this idea. And we write little notes about how we can draw connections between the ideas, because this is really where transitions happen, is in that logical connection. Another one that I like to do myself, especially when I have a huge project like a 20-page paper, I like to write out my paragraph points on, little note cards or small pieces of paper, clear off a bunch of floor space, and really put all those little pieces of paper down and just move them around, clump them, experiment with different orders. For me, it's much easier to visually either draw lines or move the items around rather than trying to try different configurations on a computer screen where I can't keep track of where all the ideas are at once. But that's how I learn. So one thing I wanted to do this quick one so I can show you one of the things that often happens once you start a logic map. So let's look at the red arrows. So the red arrows show an idea where I've gone from a cause over to an effect, then the next red arrow comes up to solution. So what's cool is then you step back and you look at these other ideas that you have on the page. In this case, it's going to be the blue ones we're going to look at. you want to start seeing if, oh man, like, can you add more ideas onto that initial path that you had, that initial red path? So in this case, I've taken the body paragraph cause, bumped it down to that to the bottom of my screen down here, right here, because these causes are connected. One's a sub cause of another one. Oh, and then I realize, hey, this one here in the middle, also a cause that I can find a connection to, and then I can go to that body paragraph idea on effect that I had originally, which leads me to solution. So it's fun. If you're a visual learner, you may like this activity a lot. I hope it gives you lots of different ideas. Honestly, if you're taking the time to think about how these ideas work together as one causing another, one solving another, if you have that kind of idea in your mind as you're writing, those transitions are just going to naturally start popping up for you. And yeah, I hope that kind of magic happens for you with your next essay. Thanks for watching.